and welcome to the 36th edition of Art Matters, organized by the Raza Foundation in collaboration with the India International Center. In the beginning, as some of you would know or recall, we used to have panel discussions. And then, since at least I ran out of subjects and also ran out of speakers, more or less, so we converted this into conversations with artists. And now this series has been on for a while. We've had conversations with Krishan Khanna, with B.N. Goswami, Nilima Sheikh, Arpita Singh, M.K. Raina, B.N. Goswami, I said again, etc. And today, after a long, persistent and almost stubborn persistence, I was able to persuade GEETA KAPUR to agree for this conversation this evening. And we are very happy that she is here. GEETA KAPUR is our best known art critic. The people who have been trained by her, as it were, people who have been inspired by her, who have had their understanding of art illuminated by her, the people who are afraid of her, etc. She has been, as you know, an art critic and curator, and her books include Contemporary Indian Artists. That was the first important book on contemporary Indian art way back in 1978. Then she had another book, When Was Modern? Essays on Contemporary Culture Practice in India. And there is another one coming maybe this year, Critics Compass, Navigating Practice. It is on the pretext of completing this book that she kept on postponing her appearance in Art Matters, saying, I'm busy writing that book. So she has been, as you know, she co-curated Festival of India Exhibition Contemporary Indian Art at the Royal Academy of Arts, London. There was this famous Bombay, Mumbai for the multi-part exhibition, Century City, Art and Culture in the Modern Metropolis for Tate Modern London, Subterrane for the Body City Project, House of World Cultures, Berlin, etc. She was a founder editor of the Journal of Arts and Ideas and was on the advisory council of the Third Text for 2 decades. Is now on the advisory board of Art Margin. And she's also an editorial advisor and trustee of MARC. GEETA KAPUR has been members of many international juries for the Biennale of Venice, Dakar and Sharjah. She was a member of the Advisory Committee Kochi, Missouri's Biennale, Asian Arts Council, Guggenheim Museum, Advisory Board, etc. So she has been a presence to reckon with. And this evening you have the opportunity to hear her. And the person who will be talking to her is SABIH AHMED, who has been an art historian and senior researcher with Asia Art Archives, which, as you know, is based in Hong Kong, but he lives here. And he has been researching or perhaps studying in depth GEETA KAPUR's work, so he is very well equipped to be talking to her. The rules of the games are that while they do talk, maybe for about an hour, basic job of SABIH, of course, is to make GEETA talk and say whatever she wants to say, provoke her into talking and saying things, and then we would have it open to the house, so you have an opportunity to ask her questions. The question should be brief, witty, not much comments, hopefully comprehensible, do not requiring a long winding theoretical answer, etc. But these are games of the rule. We hope to finish by about 8 o'clock, but should the conversation flow interestingly for you, and engagingly for most of us, then it can continue. There is no particular time limit, except that there will be time limits on the questioners, the ones who ask questions. There will only be some kind of a time limit for them, but not for GEETA, not for SABIH AHMED. So I give it over to SABIH AHMED to start, unless GEETA wants to make an initial statement.
The initial statement is that I'm going to break the rules.
Okay.
One, that we dissuaded SABIH because I give talks quite often, and Delhi audiences hear me fairly often. I am interested in the dialogue, and we have a long history now of 5-6 years of very continuous dialogue, and I have very assiduously persuaded SABIH to not just ask questions but make propositions.
Okay, fine.
And to engage with my practice, but through his lens, through his focus. That's one thing. And secondly, please do ask long questions, ask questions that require some
long
degree
answers.
of
long answers. That's right.
some degree of challenge and theoretical formulation from both me and SABIH. So thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Raza Foundation. Am I audible? Because usually the complaint against me is that I'm not audible. Am I audible? Okay, good. Now, the introduction had me places as the senior researcher at Asia Art Archive. I've had the wonderful opportunity of working very closely with GEETA and Vivan in doing an archiving project. And this had started in 2010 with the organization I work with, which is Asia Art Archive. And there have been some queries and some concerns that have stayed with me since then. And even at the launch of the Asia Art Archives project with GEETA and Vivan, subsequently we did more projects. What we titled the conference, or the launch conference, was the subject of the archive. Because as we developed this body of material, excavated all of these photographs and documents and letters, the question that kept coming to me was, is this only a kind of empirical expansion or reinforcement on what we already know of GEETA and Vivan, or what we already know of the field? Or is this really positing something about the archive? And something that kept coming up for me was that there is a subject. The archive produces subjects. The archive produces figures. The archive produces these historical subjects, which, if the person is not around, maybe it produces a different set of images for us, and we can historicize or write biographies around them. But if the figure is present, is living, the relationship between a GEETA and the figure that the archive invents, what is that relationship? And GEETA has been looking at what is this presence of a GEETA KAPUR in the 60s, of a GEETA KAPUR in the 70s, what is the relationship between changing positions, what continues, what disrupts. So with some of those queries, the subject of the archive, we had a whole series of conversations. And these conversations have taken 2 public forums so far. The first one was published in the Sarai Reader 9 in Projections, which was published in 2011 or 12? 12, I believe, yes. Published in 2012. And the kind of lines of inquiry that I had there were basically to unpack what context, some of the kind of lines of inquiries we had were to unpack what context meant for GEETA, because of her belief in vanguardism, because of her belief in modernity, and positing an Indian artist vis-a-vis the Western artist or various other positions of the artist. So what has context meant? And there were all kinds of elaborations there. We also had a line of inquiry about the place and the role of the art critic in the field, to which there were also some interesting kind of extrapolations, which you can read in the book. If the studio is an important site that art history produces around an artist, what is the site for an art critic? What are the sites that an art critic inhabits, an independent art critic? These are the kind of questions that we discussed there. It was followed by another conversation we had in, late last year, in the Critical Writing Ensemble that was organized by Take on Art magazine and Dhaka Art Summit in the Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda. So basically what I want to just say is that I want to just flag that we've had a series of conversations, and this is in continuity with that. So this is not a summation of GEETA's career at large, or all the positions, but some of the point of inquiries that have actually surfaced from the past discussions. And what I want to begin with today is basically to take the curatorial as a point of departure in our discussion. And why I want to do that is because, at least according to a lot of people, and we see it increasingly manifest today, is that the emergence of the curatorial as a concept since the 1990s can be considered as a part of an attempt to really understand cultural practices at large, because the flows of information, the way the field has been complicated, we see all kinds of collaborations and mixtures and interventions happening in the field, which are not defined by the field as we see it, which is not just about the art field, but all kinds of things that break out of the field. And so the curatorial has had an important place to play in that. And the old boundaries between making and theorizing, between historicizing and displaying, criticizing and affirming have been eroded, we can feel today. The curatorial no longer stands or no longer concerns solely with the display of exhibition making or the display of artworks. It's now understood as a practice-centered, discursive intervention that involves various people as instigators and actors. It also talks about a realigning of the field. We see all kinds of collaborations happening, all kinds of spaces emerging, where the art field is always being complicated or being questioned. It may also be a reaction to the authorial and consolidated forms of exhibition production. And I mean, I'm really thinking of the kind of realignments that the art field is taking on today. So, just to begin the conversation, what I wanted to ask GEETA first was that how has the field today, and how has the curatorial in the field really inflected her thinking? Especially with, let me just put a couple more pointers out there for GEETA, which is that people have marked that there's a discursive turn in the field. When you have the documenta curated by Catherine David, it was not just an exhibition of artworks, it was aligning it simultaneously, parallel with a discursive framing, with intellectuals, Michael Taussig and all kinds of people, anthropologists coming in and speaking. So there have been shifts via the curatorial, which have had a ripple effect around the world. And this is not about just East and West. This has impacted the field. So the first question to GEETA I wanted to ask was about how the curatorial has inflected her thinking, her intellectual work, and especially her art critical writing.
Thank you. I usually preface a question on curation and the designation that goes after one's name, critic and curator. Most people now put the term curator first and say curator and critic, and I always ask them to reverse it to critic and curator. But the way SABIH has asked this question, he's actually, in some senses, made this differentiation or this preference on my part redundant, because he's actually made the two work together as a form of criticality, which is a word which is probably more often used now than art criticism. I continue to call myself a critic, partly because I'm not technically an art historian, and because to call myself a cultural theorist is somewhat, it self-designates oneself in a way that needs more ratification from other intellectuals than from yourself. So I withhold the term cultural theorist for reasons of some degree of modesty, which Ashok was not allowing me to own. But the way SABIH has posed the question of the critic and the curator is to actually use the word curatorial rather than curation. And this is a discussion that we've been having, that to make an exhibition is an act of, or is a initiative to put together either a monographic show, a single artist show, or a configuration of artists, but it is primarily to make an exhibition. The use of the word curatorial has now begun to transpose itself on a critic, criticism, criticality. And the curatorial, in other words, has become a paradigmatic word. It is a framework in which critical thinking takes place.
Yes, in fact, it's interesting that it was in IIC maybe 2-3 years ago that a seminar was organized by FICA on curation, in which a very good point was made, that we have to stop thinking about curation only as a vocation. There are certain coordinates in the field of an artist, a curator, a writer, and some of those coordinates, of course, are being shuffled up. But what do we do with curatorial thinking. And that has really transposed itself onto all kinds of practices. There are all kinds of people who claim to be curators. There are all kinds of people who are thinking curatorially. And so there's a field that's being realigned in which the curatorial might be the best way to define it, not as a vocation. And in this curatorial disposition, what is the work that
Sabi, in fact, maybe we can take this, after a short answer, we can take it into the area of how the word criticality, which has, as I said, replaced in many ways both criticism and critique. It becomes the term which is used. I know, for example, that Irit Rogov introduces that, almost contingent with or in relationship to the curatorial mode of thinking. So I think that we need to slightly elaborate on the question of what criticality and the curatorial mode of thinking might be. But let me just say a couple of things on this. I think the major changes took place in turning the curator or a curation into a curatorial mode of thinking with possibly the major documenta exhibitions. And this may go back to Harald Zeeman at the end of the 60s, but certainly that which I have, for instance, myself encountered, and which is, besides Zeeman, always quoted as the turning point of the documenta. Documenta, for those who are not entirely within the field and who are listening here from slightly outside of the definitions of this field, is an exhibition, 5-yearly exhibition that takes place in Kassel in Germany. It started in 1955 as a reparative action after the Second World War, a bid on the part of Germany to claim back its modernity and to, in fact, to claim back not only modernity but the avant-garde. And so Documenta has been at the forefront of major curation. Now I'll just make a reference here quickly to three recent curatorial expositions. One is Catherine David in 1997. The other is the major exhibition of Okui Envisor in 2002. And then there's an important exhibition but has a different mode from the way we are discussing it, in 2007 by Roger Bjogel and Ruth Nowak. And then in 2012, Caroline Christoph Barguet-Kiev. Now, why I've mentioned these names, and there are, of course, major biennales taking place, including Venice and all across the world, very emphatically and very prominently, and in numerous ones in Asia. Why I mention this is because the discursive element, the art historical and the discursive element, was introduced on a platform which is visited and which is looked forward to and visited by huge numbers of people. And what was done, say, by Catherine David was to positive at a point where the word was not absolutely in the forefront of critical discussion, to posit the history of the avant-garde from the 1960s. What Okui Envisor did has become almost legion. He shifted the ground from art practice as an exposition with objects to a discursive field, and had what were known as the platforms, which took place in across the world, which were entirely discursive, and the fifth was the exhibition at Kassel. And what Caroline did was to create a kind of dispersal and anarchy through curatorial thinking. Her intellectual makeup has the sort of has a desire to include, but to reposition the inclusions of the current discourse. So she was, in a sense, disaligning the propositions which are already available to international art. So why I bring this in is that the curatorial in this respect is attempting more than making an exhibition. That's obvious, and SABIH has also said this. But to the extent that it is in active and punctual configuration, it is also creating a different form of criticality in terms of the engagement of the artist to the exhibition and of the viewer to the exhibition. So although it is much discussed that the curator has become overweening figure that is becoming not only an author but also an authoritarian figure within the art field, this can be part of the engagement with the idea of the curatorial. But I think the more important thing is not the power of the curator, but the power of the discourse and the realignments in art history that the curator, this kind of curatorial thinking might produce.
It just occurred to me that given even your formulation of how you've been looking at documenters and biennales and how much they've impacted your thinking around the field and, the field itself, could you say a little bit about even the Biennale conference in 2007? Elective affinities, constitutive differences, because there's been an interesting formulation that has recently been emerging, which has been around the fact that, there were two conferences organized. The first one was Talk About Curating in 2005, followed 2 years, 2004 and 2007. 5 and 7, no?
5 and 7,
yeah.
sorry.
2005, Talk About Curating, which was the first proposition to whether India would have its Biennale, if I'm not wrong. A proposition towards the Biennale in India. I believe Shiva was also part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Quite a few, no?
Shukla
Over here. Followed by another conference 2 years after, quite in the Biennale format. So Biennale taking place almost as a series of inquiries at a 2-year interval. The second one being in 2007, which was titled Elective Affinities, Constitutive Differences, where practitioners from around the world, a lot including from Asia, from Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Philippines, who were there speaking. And I remember even Rustam making a claim about if the question is about whether we're ready to have a Biennale, because that was one of the inquiries, whether India should have its Biennale, on what grounds. There were questions even raised about whether India is ready to have a partition museum, and all of these kind of questions. So what were the kind of alignments, realignments being thought of at a moment like that?
Well, the two conferences, the first was Talk About Curating, because actually at that point, which is 2005, there was a lot of talk about curating, but not of the nature that is present now or prevalent now. It was a field opening up rather than congested as it is now, which is, because the term curator is used ubiquitously for all kinds of activities today. But that no matter, it doesn't, all terms have their what should we say, spread. But we hadn't in India made a concerted bid to define the curatorial activity, curation, but curatorial activity in the way we just talked about. So that was, and we had major international art historians and critics come for that somewhat unstructured and explorative conference. By 2007, there was a definite desire and an attempt and a bid to have a Delhi Biennale. And there was several members who were the core group are here now in this audience, and there was a succession of meetings discussing it. Now, what was interesting? Sorry?
No, please go on.
Yeah.
I'll ask you.
So, over almost a year, I think. And the interesting thing is that there was a degree of questioning and forms of resistance to the normal Biennale procedure, which is to launch it, to take that big step if you can raise the money, and many cities around the world, including in Asia, have made that money available because they've seen it as related to many activities within the city as a metropolitan or cosmopolitan center. So that as long as one can raise the money through state or through private corporate funding, then biennales are launched. and they are successful or less successful. Now the interesting thing here was that there was such a slew of questions that we were raising and which we then projected through the conference. In fact, the conference was all about questions, about why, what kind, no, not at all. It's not a question, is India ready? But what is this moment where it looks like it should have a Biennale, but there still are unresolved relationships to the Biennale phenomenon, or that we want to be so different. I think it was a desire to be different, as well as, I have to say, a real problem with the funding sources. Meaning not just that the funding sources were not available easily, but we would sit there in our committee and say, we won't take money from here and we won't take money from there and we will not compromise on this. So in actual fact, there was a huge amount of moralizing which we were all doing alongside thinking the issue of an international exhibition. And the conference, by the end of the conference, when I happened to be amongst the concluding session, it looked like we had already come to the conclusion that we would not have a Biennale. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes discourse is generative, and at other times it has such a criticality to it that it, I won't say blocks, but makes difficult an event. And in a sense, this was corrected by the kind of initiative which Riaz and Bose took, or Bose and Riaz took with Kochi. Because, and I would venture to say, I'm not saying that the precedent of the Biennale conference necessarily laid the ground for that, or that they were referring back to it and thereby saying, now we have done the discursive bit and now we will do the action. But certainly the fact that it had been in discussion for so long, at a very active, punctual, located level, did make some difference to the actual launch and the event. And of course that they might have had very different ideological concerns, or they might have had a more youthful venture attached to their or available to them, and we won't go into that. But the fact that there had been a discursive precedent, whether or not it directly fed into the actual Biennale that arrived here in Kochi in 2012, I think has some value, because the discourse preceded. Now the question would be that the discourse must be kept alive, and that does it proceed further. And I think in some senses Kochi has proved through its very, very active programming and its pedagogy and its pedagogical outreach that it is just not interested in putting works up in this or that configuration. It is interested. I have never forgotten, and I think it's one of the most moving moments when Riaz Komo got up and said in introducing the Kochi Biennale, we want to make it a people's movement. Where would you get this statement? Whether or not it's realizable, whether or not it's whether or not it's utopian or rhetoric, but the statement is important.
And the Biennale conference was less of the statement, more like an inquiry into the Biennale phenomena.
Yeah.
Because this was also a time when Biennales had proliferated all around the world. And I suppose some of the pressure points for the Biennale would have been the globality of it, is what I'm assuming. I'm just wondering what were the pressure points in the Biennale conference, and globality must have been one in the hypercirculation of artists, names, objects, images.
I think globality was already being addressed through through a decision to focus more on Asia. That is why the second conference was directly related to questions in Asia. It was not that the final, that there were not curators from elsewhere, but it was very definitely oriented towards Asia, and it raised questions about why Asia. This was one of the running themes in the conference. So in one sense, globality was being addressed through a focal point, but we found then that focal point, we we actually problematized the focal point of Asia to such a degree that it didn't also seem to be the best choice to make.
Right.
There has been, just as an annotation to that, the Sao Paulo Biennale used to be based on national pavilions. Venice Biennale was from the late 19th century. Sao Paulo Biennale up to quite recently maintained that. The Havana Biennale declared itself to be a third world biennale in the mid-80s. And the Asia Pacific Triennale in Brisbane declared itself to be an Asian. So there were declarations of region, political configurations and regions before us. And that was what was up for discussion in relationship to something which would be uncritically global. Yeah.
Which then makes me go to a couple of steps back, just rewinding a bit from the 2007 moment to, was it 2002 when Century City was?
2001.
2001. An exhibition, oh, sorry. Yes. Both. I think one is enough.
Can Sabi be heard in the back?
Am I audible? Okay, good. So, no? Oh, no.
Louder, louder, louder.
Hello. So, which I then want to just take a couple of steps back, rewinding to 2001, when you were involved in a major international exhibition at the Tate Modern, under the larger banner head of Century City, in which you had co-curated an exhibition called Bombay Mumbai, and there was a positioning of not Indian art, but a particular moment in India's history that was being exhibited via, or a series of propositions being made via the art field of that moment in history, right?
Yeah. Just to give those, because this is a long time ago, it's 2000, and that was the inaugural exhibition of the Tate Modern, which is a very important point in the history of not only Britain, but in terms of international museum, the importance of international museums, which
and museum strategies, really.
Museum strategies and museum ambitions, because the Tate Modern almost overstepped the Pompidou and the MoMA to have one of the most ambitious programs that exist in in modern museums, modern art museums. So the inaugural exhibition was called Century City. It was curated by Ivona Blaswick, who's the director of the Whitechapel Gallery now in London. And she made a really bold and almost impossibly ambitious proposition that the Tate Modern, as an inaugural gesture, would map the 20th century through cities, through the metropolises that have been this focal, that have created the certain major moments in transforming 20th century art. And so, of course, she could have had 20 cities. That was not feasible. So they made a series of selections and or exclusions, and came to, for various reasons, which are not necessary to explain here, the cities of Paris, Vienna, Moscow, Rio, Lagos, Tokyo, Bombay, and London, and and New York. New York before, and London and Bombay later, because in terms of the division of the chronology of the 20th century, that's how it was laid out. And the curators were prompted but also allowed to choose both city in their region as well as the time frame. And Ashish Rajadhyaksha and I, after much discussion, chose the 90s in Bombay. And it therefore marked itself, it said Bombay, Mumbai, 1992 to 2001, because the exhibition took place in 2001 in January. And as you can see from this decade, there was definitely a political intention in this choice. It was to map the immediate precedent to our historical moment at that time, and 92 was clearly a date that was related to what happened in Bombay after the demolition of the Babri Masjid. And the political paradigm of this, however, did not exclude the fact that the exhibition, the Tate Modern, the curatorial team was interested in the metropolis. So Bombay, not just as a historical marker of a certain period in Indian history, but Bombay as a metropolis in its own terms. And the reason why Ashish was very much in the project and that I could not have done it myself is because he's a Bombay film historian and theorist, as well as the fact that Bombay means that we have to deal with cinema, and we dealt with cinema. So now I just want to add here that the other cities also chose particular moments for reasons, in each case different reasons. The choice of Lagos in the 60s was to do with the transformation of that social order in Nigeria. The choice of Tokyo choosing the Monaha period was a completely esoteric choice. Rio in the 50s is a choice which only included abstract works. So each curator chose a moment which did not necessarily make a historical chronology in terms of cumulative history of the 20th century. So that's an important thing. That's why it was a failure and a success. Because it didn't have, finally the Century City did not have the kind of coherence and impact maybe that was expected of it, but it also allowed for different lenses to look at the 20th century and the metropolis. And I might just add, and then you take on from there, I would like to say that although I was not conscious of using the word curatorial in the way that you have prompted me to use, or now we are using in discourse, I think that was curatorial thinking. Because it addressed itself to issues of the urban as the metropolis of India. It addressed itself to social relations and the violence that can explode at a historical juncture. It dealt with, or it tried to, it definitely addressed popular culture in Bombay. And it may, for the first time, I think, if I may say so, an exhibition which did attempt to map the different media that were just emerging in India. So that I might just say that Shilpa Gupta, who was I think 22 years old then or 23 years old then, we asked her to present a project, and she presented one of the many projects that she thought of. The one that was presented in the Take Modern was a live project with a live station for she was eliciting, I won't go into detail, eliciting for love letters between people writing these letters live on the, in that little booth that she had set up. And the director of the museum, Tate Modern at that time, Lars Nitwe, said in an inaugural speech, this is the first time the Tate as such has ever had technology of this kind inserted into an exhibition. So, and Shilpa is now, you know, has a reputation precisely on the basis of her first, the many first steps that she took. Well, this was one of the first, was the first. And the desire was, I think the intention was in that exhibition, not to just have people paint, people who belong to Bombay, most of them did, but to be able to map the practices that were developing in India and channeled through the metropolis.
And there's also the fact that this exhibition was centered around cities, and the city vis-a-vis the nation is something that kind of intrigues me, because a lot of your own exhibitions and a lot of your own work in terms of writing has largely been around national framing or national context. So what did Bombay mean to you vis-a-vis? Did it exemplify a particular national moment at that? And has that figured into your writing as such?
Yeah.
These kind of.
Well, two ways to answer this. At one level, Bombay was the metropolis of India, and they were interested. The subtitle of that Century City was precisely Art and Culture in the Metropolis across the 20th century. So the choice was in some senses obvious. The other other factor in this was that Bombay in 1992 was had in some senses articulated the violence and the anguish of a nation. So from Babri Masjid to what happened in the Bombay riots or the Bombay genocide, or whichever term we would want to use, that is another discussion altogether. But for that moment, the Bombay was indexing the nation in a certain way. So I don't think I even at that point give up the national frame, because that seems to be the frame in which I've usually thought, and that is both the designation and the critique of my work, that it is bound by the nation state or bound by the idea of the national and so on. So Bombay here was a metropolis which could be equivalent to any metropolis in terms of the energy and its cultural cultural configuration, and as well as that it did stand at that point for a historical moment in the nation's life.
And since then, there's been an explosion of survey exhibitions. Chalo India, Indian Highway, many iterations of these large-scale survey exhibitions happening in museums around the world. And so, I mean, this just takes some of the things that you've been attempting to kind of bring together around representation or representational agency in exhibitions to a whole nother level. So I was wondering, fast forward to say 2014, after a lot of these survey exhibitions have kind of come and gone, what was happening in a recently curated show of yours called Aesthetic Bind in the Kemol Gallery?
Yeah. Just one step.
You've done quite a few yourself.
So
largely most of your
in fact, the
exhibitions
early exhibitions were survey exhibitions. So there was at that point in the 80s and 70s, 80s and 90s, there were two ways of doing exhibitions. You did an exhibition of an artist, and the National Academy might do it, or a well, they were not called curators, but a gallery or a commissioner the word was commissioner at that time, would do a monographic exhibition or a survey exhibition. There was no notion of a theme-driven or idea-driven or ideology-driven formation. So the exhibition that, whether it was a pictorial space done for Lalit Kala Academy or the Festival of India exhibition, which in 1982 in London at the Royal Academy, which was done by Richard Bartholomew, Akbar Padamsi and me. These were definitely what would be called survey or representing Indian art at that moment, with a short history going back to the post-independence period. And I did it in another way at the National Gallery of Modern Art in '94, where it was proposed in the advisory committee that I rehang the collection of National Gallery of Modern Art. And that is obviously a national collection. It's a collection from the late 19th century to the contemporary. At that time contemporary, now they have actually receded from what would be the contemporary. It's much more a modern art gallery now. And
maybe it would be important to add here that there was, of course, a field which largely proliferated with theme-based or specific issue-based exhibitions as well, in which your premise has largely been the survey at that time, no?
No, theme-based, but Sabih, in India, and even largely, if you think of the rise of Chinese artists and rise of Chinese art, it is through huge representative and survey-type exhibitions in the first, almost the first 10 years. Of the emergence of China. Sorry?
Which was one circuit.
Yeah, but the curatorially driven and thematized or problematized proposition in curation existed obviously in various places, parts of the world. I'm just talking here, that it did not here.
Right.
And the even the realignments or the repositioning of artists within a national exhibition, nationally framed exhibition at the National Gallery of Modern Art was heavily critiqued. As you know from your archive, there's a whole dossier of attack on me for having fiddled with, played with, disturbed the canon.
The pantheon.
The pantheon and the canon. And just to end with, before coming to aesthetic bind, you mentioned nation and city, nation and metropolis. Well, the exhibition that was done at the House of World Culture, where one of the curators was Jyotendra with a show on, with his wonderful exhibition on 19th to 20th century popular and art forms. The body city was about the city, clearly. The subject or the body inscribed within the city. So there was definitely a shift there from the national into the city, and that was happening all over the world. Both because cities were hosting biennales, and so they were prominent in the discourse of curation, as well as the nation has been questioned in the European world for a long period of time, and nobody wanted to actually address the question of the national, even outside of Europe. I mean, America might, well, we won't go into that, but in Asia as well, it had already been problematized. Can you, should you have a national scale exhibition, or will the city act as a metonym? It can act metonymically, that is, stand in for the nation and yet have its own autonomy as a locus. So, yeah.
Yes.
So,
So,
aesthetic bind. Yeah. Now, aesthetic bind, I don't know how many, I mean, those who are in the art world and have actually, some of you, the artists here, have participated in these 5 exhibitions that I did, curated for Kemold Gallery's 50th anniversary, 2013 to 14, 5 exhibitions packed in about 9 months, so a very, very intense curatorial engagement. And there's a reason why I would be happy to do an exhibition or exhibitions for Kemold, because it's part of that first moment of the first generation of post-independence artists and the role of Keku Gandhi and Khurshid Gandhi in the making of that movement. But that apart, you know, I was engaged very closely with Shirin Gandhi, their daughter, and it seemed like I could make a productive engagement with which is a gallery but also an institution. It has an institutional status within the gallery system. However, what I then did was extremely private in some senses, that I allowed myself to make choices, both in terms of the thematic as well as in terms of the choice of artists, which was not based on representation of the art scene at all. So that did not give myself the either the mandate or the compulsion to be covering the field. The engagement was with artists and artworks, and if I may say so, to the annoyance of artists in the room, actually it was with artworks. I of course engaged extensively with artists, and the catalogue will have a huge, a large portion of the letters exchanged between the artists and me. But the interest finally was in the art object, and I was willing to more or less confess or to exteriorize the fact that the art object here had a certain kind of fetishist relationship to the art object, that I was in some ways invested in that art object, almost in terms of possessing it. At times, maybe to the exclusion of the artist's needs or desire. And after having made that kind of choice, then it would be a relationship between art objects. In other words, they must talk to each other, and it's not just a question of juxtaposition. Of course, all curation requires intelligent and vivid juxtaposition. That's the first principle of curation. But that's really the first principle. It would have to be some articulated spatial relationship. In other words, in the juxtaposition, some other relational qualities must arise, and that it must get articulated through that phenomenology. So, if I might say, use a word from theatre, obviously I was, in some senses, wanting to create a mise en scène, a theatric mise en scène, in which the artworks would talk to each other, or talk to, I don't like that word, would articulate their presence. And so it was in some sense an activity to successively make theatric, and I was quite conscious that they were theatric. They were not reflexive as much as they were theatric presentations. And in which subjectivity of the curator and the artist and the art object had some sort of should have, or I wanted, that they have some kind of a cathexis, that they should cathect. Just quickly to say that the total term aesthetic mind is...
I was just going to ask.
Yeah, there were 5 exhibitions.
How does this speak to the title?
No, and also just that there were 5 exhibitions. Yes. Each of them had a separate title.
Right.
Many of you know this, but the titles were Subject of Death, because it was dedicated to Bhupen, whose 10th death anniversary fell precisely when we had the first exhibition. The second was called Citizen Artist, Forms of Address. Third was called Phantomata, a term I coined. The fourth was called Cabinet Closet Wunderkammer. And the fifth was called Floating World. Now, these were independent exhibitions. They did not make up some kind of a narrative from beginning to end. There was not a cumulative or there was no relay in them. They were, they could have been motifs or tropes that I was interested in. For example, for a long time, an interest in mortality, interest in the spectre, and in the citizen artist that I've used in many discursive iterations. The idea of the Wunderkammer or the cabinet closet, because of the fact of installation being important, so that, anyway, we won't go into individual meanings. So each of them had a focal point, not necessarily or not at all related to the next. So they were standalone exhibitions, and the gallery was changed every time entirely. So that, and Shireen was wonderful in actually making what museums normally would do. But you have a question about aesthetic bind here.
Yes, all the more so because there is a reaffirmation of art that is happening in this exhibition, in the kind of relationship that you're having with art objects at a time when there's something of a sort of dissolution of the field and the kind of things that are being brought into the art world in the premise of art. And even though the artist figure is not foregrounded here, the way art is being staged, the way the art object is being staged, and you mentioned the fetishistic relationship you have with the object. What was it with regard to the aesthetic that you kind of wanted to articulate via the exhibition?
Yeah. First of all, the term aesthetic bind. The word bind is to do with being bound to the aesthetic, or at least that is how I was wanting to use the word bind. And aesthetic, the word bind also means dilemma. So I'm introducing within the term itself that I am bound, but I have a disquiet or a dilemma or a problem with this bind. And that this over-investment into the aesthetic, and I'm using the word over-investment with a certain consciousness because I realized at that point that no matter how discursive and how polemical much of my writing has been, and it has been very largely, when was modernism? The major part of what is ever referred to is the polemical part. it had two parts which had to do with artists and cinema and filmmakers, but what is always only referred to is the discursive polemical part, which is the third section. So in a sense that would be my critic's position, and underneath that as a subterrane is my what I'm calling this obsessional relationship with the art object. And in some senses I felt free to express that, to confess that. I cannot tell you what that moment is and why it happened. It could precisely be because it is, as you said, there's a dissolution of that happening. There is a questioning, and I'm absolutely convinced that that questioning is important, and that I would be precisely in stating an aesthetic bind, I am addressing the fact that this may be already an anachronistic position. And I think that a friend of mine, again Ashish Rajatak, said to me, who loved the exhibitions and wrote about them, after a year he says to me, you know, I think that was not a beginning of a curatorial project, it was the end of something for you. And it might well be the case, I'm not sure, but it could well be the case that it was somewhere making it possible for me to articulate that with the discursive and the polemical, with the ideological, the discursive and the polemical, there's one aspect of me which relates to the art object and to the creative practice of an artist in what would be older modernist terms. And that we'll come to, I think we should come to that as well. The older framework which the modernist artist and the modernist critic had. So in one sense it could be the closure of a long engagement rather than. Now
it is definitely an articulation of a dilemma, because what is happening is that in the current discussions around aesthetics and art, there's always this juxtaposition of the aesthetic vis-a-vis the politic, or the aesthetic versus vis-a-vis the political, and what kind of configurations, or what kind of relationships get established. Different artists have to negotiate with this differently, as if there is a well-established, well-understood division between an aesthetic and a politic, and in which the aesthetic either comes with extreme affirmation or it comes with an apology. That I am invested in the aesthetic project of modernity, in a sense, in producing artworks the way I do, but then I also have this much percentage of politics in it, or you know, it gets articulated in all kinds of ways. And it seems that your insistence on the aesthetic, and the way you've also titled it, the bind, in which there is of course a sort of bondage relationship to it, but also a dilemma, is somewhere, I can't say whether it's a conclusion of that position or really an articulation of it at a particular moment. In 2014, there's a time when the art scene presents itself very differently. So the aesthetic, and I mean, I think something about the bondage aspect of the aesthetic is related to art history, a particular discourse of art history that has shaped itself in 20th century, especially post-war, in which many of the references that you have used in even the discussion so far are premised on a kind of conversation that happened vis-a-vis Euro-American art history, and a kind of contestatory relationship, but also trying to deploy some of those methodologies. Whereas, of course, there have been all kinds of initiatives otherwise where, say, the Bharat Bhavan and all of these, which have also looked at, you know, other ways, other objects, and those being brought into the parameter of art, whether it's, you know, the indigenous, the tribal, the folk, indigenous being a category that you've been invested in. So to come back to the aesthetic bind and to come back to aesthetic, I think it would be interesting to hear from you about the aesthetic vis-a-vis art history as a certain you know, kind of torqued relationship.
Right. That I can answer probably more fluently. The one that you brought up first, that it is always, I mean, in our times, the aesthetic almost never comes as a singular or as a complete category. It is always, in some senses, in conjunction with politics, either as a declaration, as a declaration of a position, or as you said, an apology that is my work political or not, or my work is not political, or
is it only an aesthetic inquiry,
etc. So that is the more problematic relationship, or not. It's the more it's the more difficult relationship to articulate. And of course, this is hugely articulated. We talked yesterday when we were making our preparatory discussion of amongst the many discourses on aesthetics and politics, or art and politics, which comes from Marxist art history and which comes, let's say, up to date with Rancière. It is a running discussion. And T.J. Clarke, I mean, we could, if we wanted to, we could make a whole trajectory of art historians and critics who have raised the question, answered it in different ways at different moments of history, not art history, of different moments of history, and continues to be an issue today, and not just because aesthetics and politics make a conjunction, but because they also ask for a positionality of the critic vis-a-vis these two terms, for the artist as well as the critic, that they must take a position vis-a-vis this conjunction, and in terms of proportion, or in terms of priority, or in terms of definition. Now, an entity called the Third World, and that this was very much part of understanding of internationalism, not globality at that time, internationalism and internationalism. So the
alignments, I suppose, that you
so
thinking about the partisanship.
Within the discipline of art history, there was already a contestation of prioritizing Western art history, and so therefore what was going to be the whole issue, which we know very well, alternative modernisms, multiple modernisms, which is part of a debate which goes back to the 70s, particularly in art history. So I was part of that. Generationally, I was part of that. Ideologically, I was part of it, but I was generationally part of that. So art history as a primarily, modern art history, 20th century art history, as a primarily canonical, a field defined by the canon of the Western art historian, was being contested. Now, I think now I find myself, so I was part of that contestation. In a sense, I have changed that position now, and I cannot foresee whether this is a productive change or what. The change in position is that the contestation has produced a huge set of alternatives, which actually now don't allow for, except in terms of museums and market, the canon is exploded. And because of that, I feel much more comfortable to go back to Western art historians and to be able to use the methodology. Because I was attached to that methodology, but had a polemical reason to contest it, that had its own kind of discursive that made up one kind of discursive field. I find now that when I write on Indian artists, I don't want to have to apologize or to qualify or to explain why I put them in terms of world art history. That I will use the art history of the 20th century as the field in which a modern and contemporary Indian artist is placed. I'm not willing to retract from the methodology or that placement and that configuration. Now this will cause, I know, a lot of problems, and it will be problematized both critically by art historians and critics in India, but most of all by artists. Because,
in your position.
This position. Because what it will say is, by the back door you have introduced an antecedent. That if an artist working now, I place him or her within the structures or the field of art history, which we now don't necessarily call Western art history or Euro-American art history, that if I position an Indian artist within that and make a series of relationships which have not to do with precedence or chronology, but with the language, then I will have the best of artists saying, you have subordinated my practice to a precedent, because of course there might be chronologies that precede, chronologies in language that may precede that articulation. So if I spell out that a certain kind of abstraction, just to take an artist, I could take more controversial examples because I get into contestations on this with artists, but let us say Nasreen Mohammadi. If I now feel perfectly confident to place her within one development of abstraction, which goes back much before her, from the 50s. You could take her to Malevich and Mondrian, which goes even further, and they are the canon, there's no doubt. But even if you take non-canonical abstraction, and even within that women abstractionists from, say, Brazil, they would have practiced their abstraction before her. So, or Agnes Martin, who's older than her. Now, the question is, am I subordinating the Nasreen to a methodology and a formalism that precedes her?
I was just about to add that in this formulation, the affirmation of art history as a discipline and method that you're attributing to this discipline is coming at a time when this discipline is in crisis, is feeling a deep sense of crisis about its own relevance. And sometimes my own take towards art history is often that it feels like an artifact of 20th century modernist thinking. This discipline itself, in how it positions art vis-a-vis other cultural practices, other cultural forms, and all the more so because when I look at a lot of the artists who I'm working with via my archival project, I see a lot of other kind of creative conjunctive practices which have equally informed their artist subjectivity, and it is the field of art history that largely prioritizes the artwork, the making, the production of an artwork. And even the way, say, Rancière talks about the distribution of the sensible, there is this understanding that some things are made visible by the alignment of practices or certain forms, right? So this field of art history over 20th century has in fact prioritized and made a primary marker of the artwork, whereas in fact artist practices have been far more multifarious, and they have come into acknowledgement more and more recently. So the question really comes back to art history, and in your increasing affirmation to art history as a method, as a discipline, which can apply itself anywhere in the world, it's interesting that how this should be. I mean, is this the kind of anachronism that you're referring to?
Okay, that's a very, very good and a very difficult question, and I probably will be caught in the trap in this. To say that the field of art history is in crisis is like saying over and again this and that discipline is in crisis. Let's admit that at various points one or the other discipline is in crisis. Marxist art history, let us say earlier Marxist art history, but by the time T.J. Clark comes on the scene, and all that proceeds from there, including feminist art history, let's say Griselda Pollock, or cultural studies transposed upon art history, all of that in one sense argues against the crisis of art history as a discipline and as a methodology. But I mean, there is no reason to believe that we need to have some restricted notion of art history which does not allow for the internal changes which have taken place within the discipline of art history and which have maybe exploded it, but which have still a valence because of the referent, which, and the referent you say has changed so much that it's not only an art object, it's a series of, it's a network of, not a network, it's well, you use the word set of set of coordinates within a field which is no longer even art, leave alone art history.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in one sense, this is, I think, a valid criticism. But I would like to say that disciplines that every so often are supposed to be and are indeed in crisis. So one might say that certain kind of history writing came into crisis when the subaltern historians challenged not only nationalist history but Marxist history. So I mean, there are moments where the break takes place, and then they become part of the dialogic nature of that discipline itself. So after the subalterns, the historical project changes, but it remains a historical project nevertheless. So that's one part of the answer that I'd like to give. The other is that you are, I think, expressing your own generational and ideological preference to, or preference or prejudice, suggesting that art history in this way is a modernist proposition. Now, why is, why I would say, when feminist art history comes into play, does it or does it not, what is its position within art history? It changes the coordinates, it changes the parameters, it changes the paradigm. So, yet Griselda Pollock is an art historian. So I'm wanting to question, or to somewhat to respect as well as subvert the question in terms in which you ask it. That is one part of it. The other is that to say that there is in art history a methodological continuity.
No, that's
I mean, I myself, my own practice would not confirm that. Because if I was writing a more polemical art criticism at one point, and I write maybe less of it now, it is it is situational to that time. So, in other words, let's allow for a discipline to expand and evolve methodologies in response precisely to the historical cultural context in which, or art production in which it exists. So, I mean, this is not an adequate answer because I know where your critique comes from, and it's a very legitimate critique. But I'm answering it from my present or my position. Yeah.
And just to come to your practice, I mean, I'll just bring up two more questions and then we'll open the floor. Number one, this elaborate kind of extrapolation on art history, its relationship with your work as an art critic, independent art critic. How do these come together? Is this
sorry, say that again.
Your relationship, everything that you just described regarding art history, in defense of art history, or not the canonical and not the old school art history, but in defense of this field.
In defense of method.
Of method. How does this speak to your work as an independent art critic? Is this something that actually you feel you have to negotiate differently when you're thinking art history and your relationship as an art critic? Because is an art critic also a product or an invention of this discipline? Is a figure that forms one of the coordinates of
well, maybe an example, if I gave an example of a certain kind of art history and criticality that I do with some trepidation, privilege, is the October group. Now these are this group of art historian critics, like obviously the most famous Rosalind Krauss, Hal Foster, Benjamin Buchloh, and several others who bring out the October magazine. The use of the term October has to do with the October Revolution. So in that sense, they have a certain alignment with revised Marxism or post-68 Marxism. They also are extremely severe in their choice of what they privilege in 20th century art history. And they also are, sorry?
The Taliban.
Yeah, our friend, our artist and critic friend Timothy Hyman said when that book 1900 came out, that that
Art since
voluminous
1900.
art since 1900. He said this is Taliban art history of the 20th century. It excludes more than it includes. And so, I mean, I'm admitting my partisanship up to a point to precisely a very severe, methodologically very severe investigation of art practice. I'm not saying art object, art practice. Through my interest, or at least my engagement with, say, Rosalind Krauss or Hal Foster, these two particularly. Now, in that sense, and they act both as academic art historians, and they're also critics. They act in both terms. I am not an academic art historian, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm not. So obviously my relationship comes as a critic, so that allow myself a degree of, no, not a degree, a lot of leeway in using criticality punctually, when I want, at which angle, in which tilt, whereas an art historian may not do that, because they will follow a trajectory that they set or they contest. So I think I have a more truant relationship with art history.
And this just brings me to the last question before we open the floor, which is about the critic's compass, navigating practice. What is the practice that you're navigating, and what is the critic's compass? What is this book going to be? This is the title of GEETA's upcoming book. Since we just discussed the field, art history, the relationship you have as an art critic towards this field, and the contemporary moment.
I had several titles before this, and it'll be interesting just to mention that one of them was as moral as ends and means. And that stayed with me for a long time, ends and means. So it was ends and means as Gandhi might say it, or ends and means as a Marxist position of means of production and well, between infrastructure and superstructure. They could have, I mean, it's an ethical title, and that was a title which was with me for a long time. I've changed that title because, one, because it seemed to have to one-to-one relationship between the means of practice and the end that it comes to, and the end will always overdetermine the means in terms of the relationship of what shall we say? It'll be a more determinant. The ends will be the more determinant factor, and the practice which works towards the end will be subordinated. So there was many reasons for giving it up. One of them was simply that when I told Sheila Gowda, who features majorly in this book, she said, "What's it called?" And I said, "Ends." She said, "Oh no, like I was going to put her into a cage, you know, you have your means and you have arrived at the end." And I mean, so it was like a very spontaneous artist reaction to this title. And over a period of time, when I've titled it Critic's Compass, Navigating Practice, I think that these are metaphoric terms, clearly. So compass is my directional orientation, and also in suggesting that the compass
is determined by magnetic field.
Magnetic field, as well as that you are in some ways on a journey. So that was one of the, and navigation already has that meaning, navigating practice. And I think it was, as against when was modernism, it is to do with practice, because all the essays in it are about either an artist's practice or a group of artists who have, for thematic reasons, are put together. And so the first section is about installation and installation artists, and discussing the history, theory, and implications of installation art, not only in India, but as a practice, but through three artists. And the second section is on lens-based work, but not primarily to say lens-based work, therefore video, but the use of the lens So the first section might be called the field, and the second section might be called focus. So it is practice in the sense of individual practice or practices that make a certain kind of relational thematic as well as
Practices that make a relational.
No, that set up either a problematic or a thematic. So, for instance, there's an essay on which I've written and it's been published. Some of these essays are published, but they are in disparate places, so I will bring them together. And say on photography, then it is to do with a very particular aspect in photography that I was interested in that time, and it was the familial relations. And it says, the denouement of familial relations. So it's within a discipline of, say, lens-based work, a certain thematic would be, or a certain a certain lens would be put.
It's interesting that you are describing it as the field and the focus, as broad kind of ways through which to understand practice. I mean, as metaphors as well.
Yeah.
At this point, let's open it up.
Yeah, it's 8 o'clock.
Quite late. Any questions out there?
बहुत time से किया. 15 minutes.
Well, friends, now is your turn. You want your turn to be very low. Let the first hand be raised. It's only the first person who should have some courage to raise the hand, and then of course it will follow. So please, any one of you. There's so many young people who must have all kinds of furiously angry questions, no? Oh, yes. Yeah. Go ahead. Just a minute. Wait for the mic. And please utter your name.
My name is Vishal. My question was related to your talk about, say, monographic and survey exhibitions, and now the shift towards more thematic exhibitions. But still, in museum circles, it's almost looked as though our monographic exhibition is a breakthrough moment for an artist during the artist's later sort of age or even after her death. So could you respond to that in terms of how that is still a very specific part of exhibiting culture along with the thematic focus that, say, galleries and museums are also adopting?
Correct, that is true. Museum exhibitions and the kind of research they put into the artist they choose to present at a particular point, and these presentations are sometimes to do with the questions that are being raised in the art historical or the aesthetic or the field of art practice, or they are sometimes almost independent of them. They go through, why Alfredo Bury at the moment in Guggenheim Museum. What is the particular reason that Bury should be showing now? Or Marcel Brothers in Museum of Modern Art. So there's not always a very good punctual reason why an artist is shown at a particular time. There could also be, but you're quite right. Museums are very committed to monographic shows, and they're also extremely good at it because they do huge amount of research and put these exhibitions together, and they form what SABIH was saying, the discipline of art history. They feed that discipline, they set up a method of inquiry, and then they come to certain conclusions which take into account prior evaluations of that artist and maybe reevaluate, which is the most important part. They reevaluate the contribution, the content, the significance of the artist. So the other kind of exhibitions that are done by museums are thematic in a very much less problematized or explosive way than what Biennale curators do. So museums in that sense would be seen as conservative platforms for a recuperation of art historical material. The fact of the matter is that over and above and beyond the museum exhibition is now the Biennale. Good or bad, but it is a fact that the curators are running around the world not just seeing museum exhibitions, they are doing it to see the several hundred biennales across the world, and plus the art fairs. The art fairs are not curated, so we'll keep them out of the way, or they have a small curatorial section, which is a little sop for, you know, the discerning spectator. But the Biennale, at its most ambitious and its most successful, of course, is always a configuration. So your question is valid vis-a-vis the museum, but we must remember now that the field of art is determined possibly as much or more by the Biennale concept and the Biennale exposition. And that changes the terms of what we are calling the art historical process and its disciplinary purity, which the museum upholds. And the Biennale is constantly, every good curator wants to puncture that purity of the museum project. So I think those two exist together. And mind you, it is not only a question of the curator naming an exhibition and thematizing it. That could be one of the least important things. It's the relationships developed within that very large mise en scène. Really, I mean, a whole city now, always almost a whole city. It's that kind of insertion of art into a speciality which is so utterly different from the museum. That would determine, therefore, not simply to go by the theme, but by these insertions. And that I would address to take as part of an answer to your question about the difference of the somewhat and the attributed antiquity to the discipline of art history, because that is being preserved at one level and constantly questioned and subverted at another level.
Yes. Just a minute. Let the bike come to you. Yeah. There. Please do let us know your name.
My name is Amitesh Grover. It's a follow-up question from the idea of the museum and the fact that in the last 10 minutes we've heard the Biennale and the exhibition coming up again and again. I was wondering if you used the word mise en scène as well, and the spatial relationships that exhibitions sometimes set up. I was wondering about the temporal dimension of displaying art, and has the idea of the contemporary exhibition radically changed from the 20th century definition of what an exhibition is, in the sense that the eventness of the exhibition now seems to define the parameters of how art gets exhibited, how it circulates, how it appears and disappears. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, Amitesh, that's a question that yesterday Sabi and I had the longest discussion on the issue of event. We decided not to bring it in today because it would it's really now a big question, because the museum opening is one thing, but the Biennale inauguration is another, the art fair is yet another. So very definitely the exhibitory process is embedded within an event rather than the event following or being a consequence of the exhibition. So I think there's big discussion to be done on the question of the event. And we discussed at length yesterday that it's networking, but it's also some other form of sociality in which the exhibition is placed. Because the curators and artists are not only running around the world, but they're partying like mad in all the places. And I mean, this is not a moral position. I and older generation maybe little less, but we too, we're all in some ways inscribed within the event. So one part is this is one part of the answer. The other is something you asked about temporality. How are you asking that?
In the performative sense, that exhibitions now seem to be, the mode of exhibition seem to operate more in the performative sense of display appearances and disappearances of art practices, of art objects. So the object-related ontology of how we have understood modern art to be is now slowly being upstaged by an eventness, by a performative gesture. And so therefore, for example, the rise of interactive art practices throughout the world.
Or performance.
Or performance.
Yeah.
Expresses, articulates this anxiety. I was wondering if...
Well, it's a statement, and I agree with the statement, and I think Sabi might have something to say because we were talking about this. There was in a conference in Baroda, which was organized by Bhavna Kakkar via Take on Art magazine, as well as its collaboration with the Dhaka Summit, where Katia Garcia Anton, English-Italian art historian who now works in Oslo, she spoke about the performative, actual performance art. So not just the performative as a mode of address, but the actual performance art as well, as in some ways being both an answer to and the problem of this continuous succession of exhibitions to which a continuous series of attendance is required. And she spoke about exhaustion, or rather I interpreted what she said about some form of I think that event and exhaustion might have some relationship. And the performative in the case of an exhibition is both an answer to the fixities of the canon, of the modernist canon, let's say, and of the art object, but it is also an enactment of the extreme end of a practice. That means this practice has come to an end and we produce another mode or another form of practice. So there is a degree of entropy, that's what I would like to say, in this way of conceiving as well as the conception as well as the spectatorial relationship. There is an entropy, and I think that we are probably as much participative of the new parameters that come, as well as a realization that events produce also a degree of entropy. So I think there would be both, possibly.
If I can quickly,
Very
quickly.
A little about your performance, opening teaser in the Venice Biennale, the last one is finished, and proposed for the entire, I think, more than 100 days, the reading of Das Kapital in the kind of center of the Venice Biennale, a large space. And every day there were readings of Das Kapital in different performative ways. So this went on whether there were 5 people listening to it or 100 that sat around. So that was a very different relationship, or expanding the notion of the performance as something that excites people, and then they see something and they consume it. That this was a kind of articulation of just a text as grand as Das Kapital.
I think that's an important addition to it.
I think there's something interesting in what you're saying, Amitesh, about a performative reading of the field, which is actually very object-centric. And let me just bring this in via an anecdote. There's a meme, it goes viral. Everyone's seeing it. You don't know why you're seeing it. There's no merit in that image, in why it should be seen, but everyone's seeing it. What is that event, or what are the configurations that suddenly make the appearance of something so central to our lives? Why are we seeing this one event? It is not to do with the merit, the aesthetic merit, the political merit, who knows what merit of that circulation. It is something to do with movements, with transmissions, with intersections that are made, sometimes via an apparatus, sometimes via social mobilizations. And so I think something about reading an event into the field of art, or a performative reading of the art, is to really inquire into how something is made to appear at a particular moment. It compels us to think of this production mechanism of appearance and disappearance. And this can equally apply not just to an artwork an artist makes, but to a larger field of practice that an artist either inhabits or draws from or contributes to. So I think it's a good question to really ask of the field of art history, of art, in a performative reading in which it's not really about interactivity or an artwork or anything. I mean, the most uninteractive things can also suddenly be made to appear, suddenly be made to amplify, or suddenly be made amplified. No? And I think something about this is what I was trying to address via the curatorial, that it might not be some of those methodologies from disciplines that might attribute our objective study. It is not necessarily the aesthetic merit of an artwork that will determine its social relevance. And I'm not saying that meme is necessarily always going to be socially relevant. It is a phenomena. And that phenomena is something we have to reflect back on in terms of even the circulation of art, circulation of science.
But Sabih, just one additional question, that this circulation that you're speaking about doesn't necessarily address itself to art historical either method or art historical material or method. It is to do with contemporary or not? I'm asking. Is it to do with what Amitesh asked, the temporal as translated precisely within the contemporary? That this socialization that you're speaking about, or this social transmission or circulation, is to do entirely and only with contemporary production. And it's therefore the exposition rather than the discourse or the method that would be circulated.
No, so it really makes us test our discipline because, yes, sorry, do you want to add?
Please finish.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that.
Just a minute.
I like the question, and I think it's an important one. It comes up again and again. And I think this is actually, this is also the moment of the collaboration between the artist and the curator. So the meme that you're referring to, perfect, yes, but it doesn't have the authority of the artwork, which is what GEETA's response to you was, that because it's not located within an art framework necessarily, so let's put that aside just for a moment. But in this collaboration between the artist and the curator, let's say you have a moment like a sound moment. So then what is the play with the temporal? If it is, say, the play of the alap, when you throw it out, where does it go and rest? Does it rest in politics? Does it rest in a social moment? Does it rest in, some other form? She makes, for instance, this very interesting, and I hope, this is an interesting space between the nation and the city, but where do you drop it? That then I think is curatorial privilege.
Absolutely,
and I think that would be then the player temporality and the change of meaning becomes the most important.
But then this makes me question.
Which is what you discounted in what you said, but
no,
I would insist.
And I am discounting it partly because I have doubts in it, and the doubt is that where has art rested in the larger social imaginary?
No, so just say a little
where
more.
has art rested? I mean, if we are reinforcing the artist, if we are reinforcing the authorial, which have been, completely determined by a field and its scholarship and various components of it, various edifices, all of these things, the circulation, the relevance of art, all of these things. I mean, it's a question I keep asking myself as well. Finally, where has art rested? If when you say that regarding the author and the artist and the curator, these kind of things, these kind of relationships that the field constantly has to negotiate with the author, the artist claiming authorship, the curator claiming authorship, both finding a common ground. So
I think this was a question of staging also, staging of the exhibition.
Yes, yes.
And it would be also in response to what GEETA said about artworks annotating each other.
Mm-hmm.
What if you deny the space for annotation?
No
what
doubt.
What if you deny
no
the
doubt.
space for annotation and allow a different kind of temporality to play? That
Yes.
is a possibility.
Yes, yes.
I think what you're suggesting is a very much bigger question.
Yes, and I mean, I can't help but look at that bigger question of, I see a sense of the field that is produced and their various components that make it so robust. But there's also a larger question that keeps coming back in terms of what has fallen out of art history. Where does it go? And I'm not just talking about inclusion and exclusions. It is about this relationship of what is allowed to, or what is made to appear, and what is not. No? And it is partly circumstantial, partly collaborative, partly.
It's caprice also?
I mean, if
No, I'm asking. Because
ahead.
your first articulation of it was to do with caprice as well.
The meme circulating.
The meme circulating.
It's really hard to. I mean, it's hard to pin down. I mean, my question really that stems from Amitesh's question about the eventness is, what is this moment? How does one understand this phenomena in relation to art circulation, in relation to the object, its signs?
You use the word where does art rest? Where does art rest? Where has it rested?
Coming
What
from
is that?
Gayatri's
I think
formulation.
that is the privilege. Now, where do you make it stretch and where
Yes,
do you let it drop?
exactly.
And that is the artistic and the curatorial process.
Absolutely.
And that is the production of the
Just
artwork.
let's understand the word rest. Where has it rested? Mean where it is landed?
Where will it
Landed.
With lands, yes.
I think he's also very concerned about affect, absorption, because he said where does it mean in terms of historical terms or social terms.
In the larger
Where
social
has it
realm.
landed?
Where does it land? Is it within this configuration of a field? What does one mean by this field in relation to a larger social kind of imaginary?
For that you have history, no? You have the whole of history to play with.
Right. And the appearance of things and the archives it chooses and all of those, yes, absolutely.
Any more questions? Or have we landed at the end of the evening?
How do you deal with the electronic field?
How do we deal with the electronic field? The electronic field is dealing with us. it's a. I mean, I'm sorry.
Isn't it? I mean, isn't it kind of beyond the museum, the Biennale? There's an entire.
If you mean the digital.
Yeah, the digital
yes,
and electronic,
which
which is partly also lens based.
Yes,
it has become an entirely new field, which is being quite actively.
It has complicated all fields, that's for sure. Yeah. It has complicated all fields. It has made us question authorship and really made us familiar with the fact that images don't rest necessarily. Images do all kinds of things. But I don't know how to answer that question because it's a really big one.
Well, friends, with this we come to the... Oh, yeah, please. Why?
A very short question. My name is Werner from Belgium, and in the last, let's say, 10 years we have seen artists creating shows. I would like to ask you what's your vision, opinion on the fact that artists are becoming also curators?
There is a history of that, and it's embedded actually in practice much before our present moment. If you take Marcel Brothes, you come from, he comes from, his practice itself is to do with, what should we say, for curation. It's a artist mimicry or subversion of curation, so long before curation was in fact even a category to be discussed. So artists have actually in the long history of the 20th century acted as well as subverted the curatorial project. Now the artist curator is, I think, almost directly to do also with two things: institutional critique, where the curator is seen to be part of an institutional structure which is to be questioned or demolished, as well as it is a consequence of the ubiquity and the importance and the presence of installation artists. So an installation by an artist, and this has been wonderfully argued and theorized by Boris Groys, that much of the artistic activity in himself or herself today would be a curatorial activity. In other words, the installation has built into it a relational aspect or between objects or data, which can be subsumed within or which can extend the curatorial. So in actual fact, there's already a reason and a ground for an artist curating, because their own practice often impinges on or transgresses or includes the curatorial act. And I've been a little, sometimes for instance, a little unsympathetic to or critical of institutional curation being offered to or handed out to an artist. And it was how, if I might be very particular, there have been debates of why Kochi Biennale has emphatically said up to now that it will be an artist curator. It seemed to me that there is a certain kind of curatorial thinking which an art historian and critic is more aligned to. I think in a sense I've been proven wrong. And this could be the case over the all across the world, that there is a different kind of a phenomenology that an artist might create. The choices, the relationships, a degree of maverick, a degree of arbitrariness and even caprice that might be brought in. The first Kochi Biennale had much of that. And in a sense that may be an affirmation of the double role or the changing role.
Yeah, just a minute. Let the mic come to you.
This idea of where does the art rest, I just remember this, there is a very beautiful text by Deleuze on, he's explaining Nietzsche's idea of eternal return. So he talks about this dice throw game. So the moment you throw the dice in the air, and it's a moment of chance and it's circulating in the air. So how that air becomes the land, but it's continuously circulating. So any freeze moment would be the ground. So I think I'm just relating with this idea of curatorial. So maybe that what curatorial does with that moving dice, suppose that moving dice is the artist or the artwork, so curatorial could freeze that moment and find out that fictional proposition, okay, this is the ground. But see again, Deleuze again talks about that moment of, so he says that when the dice is moving, that is the moment of chance. And when it falls on the ground and you see the number, that is a moment of necessity. But the interesting thing is the moment that dice fall on the ground, someone else take it and throw it again. So I don't think there is a moment where artists rest, but artist is again and again he's thrown before it was happening by curators or like some organizer or whatever. But now artists also taking the power to themselves. So suppose you see this exhibition, Kirana, the museum, the photographer, what is his name? Dayanita Singh, where she is performing as a curator. And we have a lot of examples, Xerox and a lot of people else. I think Amit's question also coming from that angle where he is an artist, but his performances are so large, huge, and the scale is huge. So that needs the skill of a curator, organizer. He has to manage everything, the space, design, he has to put the light and everything. So that is like, I don't see that anywhere artist drop somewhere. It's always like floating in the air. And any freeze moment could be that moment where, like the way she identify Shilpa Gupta's first exhibition. I think that's a fictional freeze. She freeze that moment. So so that.
Thank you. Well, I think not asking a question but making a statement, you have concluded the evening for us. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a most scintillating, illuminating conversation between GEETA KAPUR and our friend. And thank you very much for being there. The Raza Foundation organizes tomorrow at the India Habitat Center, Gulmohar Hall, Habib Tanveer Memorial Lecture to be given by Shanta Gokhale. So any of you who are interested in theatre, or even who are not interested in theatre, are most welcome. The next Art Matters will be on the 12th of April, when Rubina Karode talks to A. Ramchandran. Please note, mark the date and do come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you, Ashok, for this opportunity.